Hello and welcome to the Changing the Perception of Sales podcast, Series 3. Last year, we spoke to SDRs, BDRs, and people earlier on in their sales careers about their journeys, tips, and why people should get into the industry. This year, we'll be speaking with sales and business leaders about their journeys, how they've made their success, and their insights into sales as an industry, especially what needs to be done to change the perception of sales. I'm Lizzie.
I'm Kyle, and still for far too long, people have just been falling into sales. Through this podcast and by having conversations with industry leaders, we're looking to continue to change the perception of sales and make it a career of choice.
Today we are joined by Immy Toms, Sales Development Program Manager at Softcat. On this episode, Immy shares with us a very inspirational story about how she's lucky to still be here with us today, her experience with neurodiversity and also her progression into management within sales. We'll also be speaking with her about the importance of diversity and inclusion and how important that is in changing the perception of sales. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome to this episode of the Changing the Perception of Sales podcast, and today we are joined by Imogen, better known as Immy Toms. Immy, massive thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And to kick things off, Immy, then, it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself, tell a bit to the listeners about who you are and the company you currently work for.
Yeah, so fine. So my name's Immy. I work for Softcat, who are the UK's #1 value-added reseller. So essentially, I work with about 20 customers in the northeast of England, making sure they have everything they need in terms of their technology. And my job role is as an account manager and also as an SDP and apprentice manager.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And we'll be coming on to the apprentice and SDP manager a little bit later as we start to talk about your journey and how it's progressed at Softcat. But we always like to start on the podcast at the beginning, really. So to kick things off on the journey, how and why did you get into sales in the first place?
Yeah, so I was at the University of Leicester. I had just finished my undergraduate in English with creative writing, and I was doing my master's in modern literature. I had fully intended to go straight into doing my PhD. It had always been my dream to be a doctor, just something I'd always wanted to be Dr. Toms. And I'd applied for scholarship funding, and then all of my friends were looking for graduate jobs. And I remember thinking, why don't we just see what's out there? So I went on the Prospects website. I filtered the jobs from high to low in terms of earnings, which I think probably says a lot about why I work in sales. And I read through a few of them, just didn't feel like anything was quite the right fit. And I came across Softcat, and the values really spoke to me. The opportunities they gave, I just found it really interesting. And so it was the only graduate job I applied for. I went through the interview process and I went to the assessment centre thinking I'll just see what it's like and whether I like it, if I feel like it's a potential career path for me, but really still set on doing my PhD. And I met a chap called James Wiley, who actually sits behind me in the office now. And the way that he spoke so passionately about the opportunities that sales had given him and the relationships he had with his customers and just how much he loved his job, I was instantly sold. I was hooked. And I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And 2 years in, still feel exactly the same. Absolutely love my job. So yeah, that's how I didn't really fall into sales, I guess. I very much chose it.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because it's something that you kind of went on Prospects and seeked out to do, but obviously the initial plan was to be, Dr. Toms.
Yeah.
Where did that initial motivation or that career path direction come from?
Yeah, I've just always been really academically minded, I suppose. I've loved reading, I loved education. It sets the path for you very clearly when you're at university, I feel. And I knew I was really passionate about what I was studying. So my studies were in post-apartheid South African literature, very rogue, very niche. But I really enjoyed studying, and I knew that I had some good opinions to contribute to the space, and I loved a good debate. So English for me was like a natural progression of just debating a topic, really getting into the nitty-gritty of it, doing the research. So and my grandparents were both doctors. They were medical doctors, not academic doctors, I suppose. But it was something that I was just always hugely fascinated by, that you could get to being that high up in your field. And I've always been very ambitious. So as soon as I started my undergraduate degree, I had the path laid out in my mind: masters, PhD. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lecturer. I want to teach others. I want to help others, coach others. That for me was a massive part of it. And I suppose still now working in sales, carry a lot of that with me.
Yeah. Interesting. And I guess this comes on to the next point. We always like to, we just wanted to change the perception of sales, understand what people thought about sales before they got into it. And on the face of it, a lot of people would go, well, you want to be a doctor, now you work in sales. Like, what's going on there? But what was your perception of sales before, you even went on the Prospect website and heard about Softcat?
Yeah, I think like most people, my perception of sales was exclusively the Wolf of Wall Street, that sort of really male dominated environment, very competitive, driven, not much regard for customers, just wanting to sell constantly. That was definitely my perception and couldn't be further from the truth. Now working in sales and knowing it as I do, my whole job revolves around making sure that my customers are happy and having a good relationship with them. And also with the people I work with, because I rely so much. I'm not from a tech background at all. As I said, I did English at uni, so I've got no real tech knowledge in depth. So I rely a lot on those internal relationships. So for me, sales as a job, in my mind, is all about relationships, building relationships, being able to maintain them, understanding what people need, understanding how to help them, how to adapt to work with different people. That to me is what sales is. So I was very, very wrong. It's not. And in my office, I'm very fortunate to have a lot of really strong female characters who are very successful. And my managers are both women, which to me is incredibly empowering and encouraging because they are both so successful and driven. So I was very wrong about sales. And I think a lot of people will probably say the same when they come into this job. It's not what you expect it to be, but it's exactly what I'd hoped, I suppose. I'd hoped that it would be all about people and relationships, because for me, that was what really spoke to me in the whole interview process, was how much of it was focused on you as a person and bringing your own character into the role. And that's something that I think probably is why I've done quite well in this job, because I've been able to build relationships with people and understand what they need and how to help them, which is the bit of the job I absolutely love.
Yeah. Good. And on this occasion, I'm really glad you were wrong, actually, about your perception of sales. That's the whole point of why we're doing this. And what I'm really happy about is the fact that you still continued with it. Because a lot of people have that perception and then never even click the apply button or never even go and prospect in the first place. And that's why we want to encourage this conversation. So that's not the case for other people like you that are looking to break into the industry. Um, and I think one thing you mentioned as well, it's really important in us helping change the perception of sales, is having inspirational female leaders in the industry that you can look up to, which I'm sure is something that Lizzie will touch on later on in the conversation. But I agree, it's very important. Now, one thing I want to come on to, we noticed this on your LinkedIn. You shared a post about it a few months ago. It's fair to say, Immy, that it's not always been plain sailing for you, I think would be a fair assumption,
I
in just
think
your
that would be
education
fair.
and sales life as well. So very fair indeed. So I guess just for the listeners, if you don't mind, just share a bit about, I guess, your journey and maybe some of the adversity that you've had to overcome to get to where you are now.
Yeah, of course. So I was in my final year of my undergraduate studies. It was April 2019, so I was about 2 months away from my final exams. I'm very open about the experience as a whole. So I was on a night out with some friends. It was Easter Sunday. My mum's a vicar, so we'd always celebrated as a family. And it was freezing cold that night. I was running for a taxi. I was in heels running for a taxi, and I tripped and I fell. Just, we've all been there. We've all had a tumble on a night out, and I hit my head on the pavement. And I really can't remember a lot of the time after that, the next few weeks for me specifically. But essentially what happened was I had 2 bleeds on my brain. So I had a subarachnoid hemorrhage and a subdural hematoma. I fractured my skull in 2 places, and I had a stroke. So I was very unfortunate to sustain such severe injuries from not a major trauma, essentially. The type of bleeds that I had are they carry a very high mortality rate. So one of them has between a 50 and 90% mortality rate, and the other has a 33% mortality rate. So I had both. So combine those, and my odds were very low. And I actually spoke to my mum about it this morning ahead of this podcast and sort of asked her for her perception on things, because I can't remember a lot of it, which is very normal for people who've had brain injuries. But they sat my parents down in the waiting room and said, we don't think she's going to wake up with all of her function, basically. And somehow, despite everything, I woke up, I spoke to my parents, I spoke to the doctors, and I was incredibly lucky. They kept coming round to the ward and saying that I was a miracle case. They had no idea how I'd come out of it the way that I had. But for me at the time, that was the most life-changing, incredible experience for a while, because I thought, I should be dead. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be able to move, to talk, to walk, to do all these things, and I am. And that to me I was so inspired and so completely changed by the experience. So initially for me, it was, I want to get on with my life. And doctors were telling me, we think you should defer your masters. Don't sit your final exams. You need time to recover. And I was on cloud nine. I was like, no, I want to get on with it. Let's go. Come on. I want to go and do them. And I did. I went and sat my final exams and I graduated with a 2-1. But it took a while for it all to set in and to really feel the after effects of it. And I spent the next few months really struggling. I was incredibly isolated. I lost my ability to properly communicate with everyone around me. So I had something called receptive and expressive aphasia, which is basically in conversations with people, I could see them talking, I could hear their words, but I couldn't process them in my mind, and I couldn't reply to them in the way that I always had been able to. And it genuinely felt like there was a wall up in my mind where I really couldn't communicate with anyone properly. And I can't explain the isolation that I felt. I felt disconnected from everyone around me and from the whole world around me. And it was terrifying. It was really scary. But my dad actually, and this is crazy, my dad also had a head injury when he was 21, and I was 21 when I had my head injury. And I remember, yeah, it's crazy. But I remember speaking to my dad about it and him putting it in such a succinct way that I understood, which was, it's like someone, and this is the best way to describe it to other people, it's like your brain is a filing system and you've grown up with it used to exactly how everything's filed for years. And when you have a brain injury, someone comes along and they dump the filing system and files go missing and they get muddled. And you spend the next months, years of your life trying to refile those things away. And so that's what I really focused on, is just trying to get back to me and understand myself again. And I had changed and I had to accept that, but just be okay with that and be content with that, and learn to re-establish my relationship with everyone around me and the world around me, because everyone was terrified of it. They didn't know what was happening. I didn't really know what was happening. And it was a really, really hard, I'd probably say that the first year was incredibly difficult for me and everyone around me, because none of us knew what to expect. And no one can prepare you for this, for that sort of thing happening. But we're almost 4 years on now, and I'm very fortunate to have a lot of my life back and a lot of the things that I lost back, and feel like a better person for the experience as a whole, without a doubt.
What an incredible story that is, by the way. Like, very, very inspirational, Immy. And I really like the analogy you used as well, because again, it's a good way for, I guess, other people that haven't been through that to understand. And I guess somewhat, this might sound a bit strange to say, somewhat fortunate that your dad had been through a similar thing at the same age. So I guess there was someone there you could lean on for, I guess, thoughts, advice, insight on maybe how best to deal with it. But what was it like, at the time when it happened? 'Cause you would have been at university, I think, or just finishing your master's, you said. So what was it like still trying to achieve the things you wanted to achieve despite having limitations, I guess?
It was really hard. Doing my final exams, so it was my undergraduate year. So doing my final exams I can't remember it at all, basically, which is very normal. It happens. It's a period of trauma in your brain, and so your brain shuts down a bit. that was the difficult bit for me. Getting through that side of things was okay. All I had to do, I was fortunate that I'd set myself up very well, that all I had to do was sit the exams and I would be fine. I'd come out with my 2-1 and I would be fine. And I did that. It was going into my master's that was near impossible in the first few months. And for someone who had never failed a module at uni, never struggled really with the education side of things, I did my first assignment and I failed it in my master's, and I was distraught, and I sat outside the library on the phone to my mum and said, I just cried and I said, I can't do it, mum. I really wanted to do it and I can't do it. And my mum is the strongest woman I know, and she sat me down and she said, time to put on your big girl pants. You can do this. You are so much stronger than you know. You've got through this. You've got through the hardest year of your life and you've wanted this and you can do this. So I started working with the university and I found ways of working that worked for me. And I think where I'd been going wrong before is trying to do everything the way that I'd always done it, because my brain had changed completely. It had rewired itself in a different way. It was reorganized. And so I had to learn how to work for my new brain and the new way of working for me. And I think that's probably the key thing that I've changed about myself now is, for me, my life is about working with my disability and with my issues and not against them. And I really had to learn throughout my master's year how I could work with it. When I got too stressed, when I started getting migraines, I had to stop. Can't push through it. I found out it didn't work. And if I was having a time of great flow and it was all going well, work through that, great time to do it. And it was incredible because I finished my master's with a merit, which is the equivalent of a 2-1 at a master's level. And I also was awarded the Waddington Prize for the highest dissertation grade. And it was on something I was so passionate about. So for me, that year, although it was without a doubt the toughest year of my life doing that master's, it's my proudest achievement because I really wanted to quit and I was so close to quitting. And I managed to pull myself together, have a good firm chat with myself and remind myself that if I could overcome what I overcame, this was something I could get through. I just had to push through it, find a way of working that worked for me and make it work within that time. So I'm very proud of that year of my life, and I think it probably is my proudest achievement to date. Yeah.
Amazing. Again, what an example of, I guess, just sheer resilience, really. I mean, let's be honest, it's against the odds that you'd probably still be here and then went on to, achieve what you've achieved is really, really commendable. And one thing I want to move on to now is you said the main, I guess, disability or limitation, particularly at the beginning, was the ability to communicate and maybe process what other people are saying, which, let's be honest, is kind of important when it comes to sales, doesn't it? Like, if you think of all jobs out there, sales is probably one where those two things are most important. You said you've learned how to live with it, basically. So from a sales perspective, what do you do now or what have you done in your sales career so far to work with it and to ensure that you can, still be as successful?
Yeah. So when I started at Softcat and I started with cold calling, that to me was the biggest challenge to overcome because my speech was still pretty unpredictable at the time. I didn't know when it was going to hit. And obviously, on a cold call with a customer, that was incredibly daunting to think that I might fumble over my words, say the wrong thing, stutter, those sorts of things. But I suppose the key thing is I became very intuitive with myself and knowing when it was a bad time, knowing when I wasn't in a good mental space to do it. And so I would focus on other things within that time. I would do LinkedIn targeting, I would do email targeting, I would do research, I would read annual reports, I would focus time that I knew that I wasn't quite there to doing other things. And then in the time that I felt, I suppose, more normal, more capable, I would really use that time to focus. And I actually think this isn't something that's exclusive to living with a disability. I think that it's something that as you know, salespeople we should be doing, is playing to our strengths, playing to our times where we feel more motivated, more driven, more capable, and times when maybe we feel that we're not quite in that headspace. I think that it's something that I have to do to make my working day work, but I think it's something that a lot of people could benefit from, just being more in tune with knowing when it's the right time for them to have a really great phone call, or when they're trying to push through something where they're maybe having a bad day and it's just not quite there. Maybe it's best to just wait till tomorrow. Maybe it's best to wait till later that day. I think that it's a good thing to understand yourself and know when it's prime time for doing your calls and when it's time to sort of focus on more of the research stuff, because the research stuff is equally as important for me. That's how I've built some really great relationships with my customers, is understanding how they work as a business, and that's through having that downtime to do my thorough analysis, I suppose.
No, thank you for sharing. And am I right in thinking, Immy, as well? There was something else you've recently, or within the last year, been diagnosed with, in addition to everything that happened kind of a few years ago. If you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah. So I was 4 months into working at Softcat. It's a funny story. I had my tonsils out, just standard procedure, and a nurse noticed something in my recovery. She said, "You're not recovering very well, and we think there might be something wrong here." And I sort of batted it off at the time. I just started this great new job. I really just wanted to get on with it. And I had a referral. I went along to see a rheumatologist in London, and sat down with him, really not thinking anything of it, thinking nothing was going to come of this. And he said, "Yeah, you've got Ehlers-Danlos syndrome." And I looked at him and went, "Sorry?" And I was in shock. I went away and did some Googling to find out what it was, because I'd never heard of it before, and most people haven't. And it turns out it's an incredibly rare hereditary disorder that affects about 0.02% of the world's population. So it's a connective tissue disorder. So the way that they described it to me is everyone else's connective tissue that holds their body together, your organs, your muscles, your bones, joints, everything that essentially holds you together as a person. Yours is like cement and mine is like chewing gum. So it's elastic. It affects all of my organs, my general function. And it was a massive blow for me at the time, having just started a job, doing really well, loving it, being told I had something that was going to change my trajectory. It changed a lot about what I could do. I was really into my cheerleading at the time, and that was something I had to bench as part of being diagnosed, because I was so susceptible to dislocations and sprains as a result of having that condition. And my sister was also diagnosed because it's obviously hereditary, so it runs in families. And for her, it's far more disabling than it is for me. For me, it manifests in chronic pain, chronic fatigue, general feeling of unwellness most of the time. And I think I spent a period of probably mourning, I would say, where I felt quite sad for myself. You know, I think as most people do, if you get a diagnosis that changes things, I just felt so heartbroken, lost, not really sure what to do now. But now, being sort of a year and a half on from that diagnosis, I feel very fortunate that a nurse pointed that out, because I know so much more about myself now and I know how to deal with it better. And I've learned, again, it's about being intuitive with myself. I know what works for me, what doesn't, my limitations, what I can and can't do. And I think I spent a lot of my life feeling like an outsider, because my friends would want to go and do really long walks and things, and I would always be really reluctant. And I think I thought a lot of the time I was just lazy. And now I understand myself so much more, and know what I can and can't do, and when to push myself and when not to. And for me, that has been incredibly empowering now, to have that diagnosis, to understand myself and help me to work in the best way possible for me, because my Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and my condition looks completely different to other people's. It looks completely different to my sister's, and what I can do, she can't do. What she might be able to do, I can't do. And so it's about understanding myself and the limitations of my condition for me. I think that's so important to stress, is disabilities are, you can't compare two people's conditions. Everyone suffers with it differently. Everyone is on different areas of the spectrum, and you can't, whilst I am very lucky not to be wheelchair bound or bed bound, I still struggle day to day with the things I do. And I think it's something we talk about a lot. Softcat is people feeling a sense of imposter syndrome, that they're scared to call themselves disabled or neurodiverse because they feel a sense of mine's not as bad as other people's. And that's something I 100% struggled with for a long time. But being able to accept that and accept your condition and the limitations of it and learning to work with it is actually, for me, it's been the most empowering experience, because now I know how to manage my day in the best way possible and get the best out of myself. And that to me is, it's exciting. I'm happy to be in the place that I am, where I understand myself more than I probably ever have in my life.
Wow. And you mentioned neurodiversity, and we'll come on to that in a second. But two things you kind of mentioned so far is maybe the feeling of sadness that you had when you got the diagnosis, and then you mentioned about the feeling of isolation a few years back, but also with that diagnosis again. I think there are probably two feelings that people in sales can probably get quite regularly anyway, given the guess the difficulties or the challenges that you can face when doing the job. So how did you deal with those feelings? So for anyone listening that maybe is going through it can maybe resonate or take some advice from what you have to say.
Yeah, I think the key thing for me has been speaking to other people, and especially other people who've been through similar things. Obviously, with the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I'm really fortunate to have my sister who has it as well. So we share a lot of our moans and our groans. But it is something, as a network at Softcat, we talk about a lot, of feeling like you're burdening people when you talk about it, that you're being annoying, that you're moaning, you're complaining. But honestly, it's so important to have conversations about your feelings with other people. And our jobs are stressful. Sales is a stressful job, and you're tasked with making so many people happy all at once. And that's incredibly tasking on you as a person. And especially if you're dealing with lots of other factors that make you feel isolated or concerned or generally down. And I think my advice to anyone would be, speak to someone you feel comfortable with. It doesn't have to be your manager. It doesn't have to be your mum or your friend. If you feel comfortable with someone at work, you know, I've been so fortunate that people at Softcat have reached out to me, having heard my story and spoken to me about it. And to me, that's a privilege, the fact that people feel comfortable enough to come to me and talk about their experiences. But I think that's the key thing, is these should be open conversations. It's not something to be ashamed of or hide away from. It's opening doors, and that's really what Softcat are trying to do as a whole within our networks, is to make it okay to talk about these things and to ask questions. So if there are people out there who do feel isolated, then find someone that you feel comfortable with, or someone that you can identify with, and just have a chat with them about it. Because honestly, people are much nicer than you think, and getting things off your chest is, for me at least, always the way to go.
Cool. Great advice there, Immy. And coming back onto what you mentioned, and diversity comes in many different forms, doesn't it? And you mentioned neurodiversity, and honestly, I think it's something that a lot of people probably still don't know the true meaning of, or certainly that businesses or people just need educating on. So it might seem such like a naive and basic question, but what is neurodiversity?
So neurodiversity is a spectrum of conditions that essentially affect your brain function in several different ways. So it's estimated that about 1 in 5 adults in the UK identify as neurodiverse. So it covers conditions from Tourette's to ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia. For me personally, I have OCD, so I identify as neurodiverse. And obviously, having had a brain injury, my brain looks completely different to the what I suppose would be termed neurotypical person. But neurodiversity as a term just encompasses anyone whose brain functions slightly outside of the norm of the neurotypical brain.
Thank you. Definitely learned something new there. And 1 in 5 people actually was probably more than I would have initially thought. Again, no data or science behind that, but would it be fair to say that there may be some people that do have one of those conditions that maybe don't feel comfortable in sharing that with a potential employer, particularly in sales as well, maybe given the stereotypes? And if so, what advice would you give to them if there's someone that has that feeling or isn't too sure? What advice would you give to them about maybe coming forward?
I think that the key thing for me personally is empowering managers to understand how to deal with this, especially for people who are applying to jobs. It's not something that people are going to be forthcoming about a lot of the time. I didn't walk into my interview and say, "Hello, I'm Immy Toms, and by the way, I've had a brain injury and I've got OCD," and I didn't list my conditions, because it's not something you do. But I often think back about my interview day and how, if I was having a bad day with my communications, if I was stuttering, how differently it would have gone. But I didn't have the chance in the interview process to say, "I have a special requirement," or "I have something that I'd like you to be aware of." And that for me was a big part of joining the network and being a core member, was trying to change that. I think it's something that employers should be opening conversations on, because it's not something people are forthcoming with, but if you ask the question, they'll talk about it. I think if there are people who have been working their job for a while now and do identify as neurodiverse but haven't made someone aware, I would 100% encourage you to do so. More than anything, it allows your managers, your peers, to be more considerate of what they're saying, because sometimes, especially say someone has dyslexia, and especially in sales, they send an email and things are misspelled, and a manager comes and has a conversation and says, "You need to be more careful." That manager has no perception of the fact that that's a really insensitive thing to say, because they have no idea. But the issue is that barrier of communication. And the only way that that's ever going to change is by managers asking the questions, and salespeople, employees in general, being more comfortable with opening up. So it's something I do with my new starts. When they come in, I sit them down and I say, "I have these conditions and these might affect me in these ways. Just to make you aware, it might affect our relationship in these ways. If there's anything you want to talk to me about, feel free." I open the conversation. And that's the key thing for me, I think, is it has to come from both sides. We have to open the conversations, but just have a sit down with your employer or your manager and say, "Hey, did you know I have OCD? This is how it affects me. This is how it might affect my work." More than likely, your manager will say, "Wow, I had no idea. Thanks for telling me." And all you've done there is give yourself an opportunity to have your manager know you a bit better and how to help you, because ultimately that's what we're here for as managers. We want to enable you to work in the best way possible and to be successful in the best way possible. And if we don't have all the information, it can make it really difficult to help you, because it's not helpful to say to someone who's dyslexic, "You should go on a spelling course." It's not helpful at all. But we can find better ways with different tools that could help enable you to, spell checkers and dictators and things like that, that there's so many wonderful things out there to help people with different neurodiversities now, that having the conversation opens all of those doors and can be a game changer for people working in sales, for sure.
It's so interesting what you've just said, because we've very recently done another recording with a sales leader who talked about openness and sharing vulnerabilities, and they actually used the exact same phrase, game changer. Like, the moment they started being open with their vulnerabilities or things that they'd been through, it was just a complete game changer for the rest of the team. So it's really interesting that you've said that as well. One thing just to touch on then, before we move on to the next part of the conversation, but let's be honest, said before, it's kind of, you've beaten the odds a little bit, really, Immy, so far with everything that you've shared. How much does this motivate you now? The fact that you've had to overcome so much adversity, how much do you think this motivates you to almost prove a point?
For sure, it definitely does motivate me. The key thing for me is I've been given an opportunity that not many people in my position have. And one of my brother's friends had the same type of brain injury as me, and he passed away. And moments like that to me are reminders of how close I came. So I'm a yes person now. It's changed me as a person, and opportunities, when they come, I always say yes to them, because I feel so grateful to even have the chance to be here, to be on this podcast right now. I mean, this to me is an incredible experience, and working for Softcat has done that for me. I've been able to, because of my adversities and the difficulties I've faced, I've been able to do so much that I never thought I could. I hosted a panel session with the comedian Rosie Jones, which to me was the most mind-boggling experience, and I still can't believe I did that. But I will always take opportunities, because for me, I just feel lucky to be here. I feel lucky to have the chance to do all these things, and I feel it would be such a waste of me to not live my life to the fullest, to not try my hardest in everything I'm doing. And I love my job. I love being a manager. I love working with my customers. And for me, given the experiences I've had, there is no point for me not to give 100% to everything and to try my hardest. So and to my family as well, who went through the whole experience with me, like, I want them to be proud of me and for them to feel like I've come such a long way, and to be able to enjoy my life. And that's what this opportunity has enabled me to do, working in Softcat. Is I love my job, I love the people around me, and that the experiences that I've had, as terrible as they were, have changed me as a person for the best way possible. So they're massively motivating to me. They keep me going day to day. And when I'm having a really bad day at work, nothing's going right, I just have a tough conversation with myself and say, you've overcome so much worse than this. You can get through a bad day at work. Pull yourself together. And it usually works a trick, and I'm fine.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, Immy, so much for sharing that story, and what a story it is. I suppose then to touch on, because you've mentioned it a couple of times when you were speaking there about networks and then communities that you're involved in, that have been really important to you, or helpful, I suppose, in terms of keeping up communications and speaking with people. Starting this question really broadly, actually, but tell us a little bit more about the networks that you're a part of at the moment.
Yeah, so at Softcat, I am a core member of the EDN network, which stands for Empowering Disability and Neurodiversity. Quite a mouthful, hence why we've shortened it to the EDN. As a network, we've been around for almost a year. In fact, it's our first birthday next week. We've got cupcakes coming to all our offices, which is fun. But
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've been established for a year, and the key goal of that network was to unite all of our employees who identify with having a disability or a neurodiversity, or we have people within our network who are carers for people with disabilities, or who are allies who just want to understand it more. And the key goal has been to empower employees to work in the best way possible for them and to share their stories. And I cannot tell you, the first call we had as a network, we sat probably for a good couple of hours, and everyone just shared their stories about their conditions. And it's one of the most powerful things I've been a part of in my whole life. And I carry all of those stories with me now. Everyone's experiences are so different. And these are people I'd worked with for a year, and I spoke to them daily, but I never had any idea of what they were going through. And that was my first time really opening up about my experience. And it was terrifying. But the support that I felt from that call was like nothing I've ever felt. And we all still talk about it to this day as one of the most powerful moments in all of our times at Softcat, was that unity of that shared experience from all of us. But as a network, we're at almost 100 members within Softcat. Our key goal is really to change the industry, to be honest. We want to be the leaders in our industry for driving that positive change to help employees who are living with a disability or a neurodiversity or a carer to work in the best way possible, and to share their stories with their managers, and to be heard and understood, and to make the changes they need to have a fair playing field, because that's all any of us really want, is a fair and equal opportunity to do as well at this job as we possibly can. So it's such an important network within Softcat. It's the newest network, and as I said, almost a year. So that's great. And then the other network that I'm very heavily involved in is the Pride Network. So I identify as queer personally. I've been involved in that since I joined Softcat. It's just such a fun network. It's an inspiring network. There's so many different types of people, so many characters. We have people who identify all across the LGBTQ plus space. We have allies within that network. And the key goal really is to celebrate diversity, to celebrate all of our differences, to create an inclusive and diverse environment where people can thrive and feel proud of their differences. And I think that's the key theme across all of our networks, is celebrating our differences and having them be something that's a positive and exciting thing at Softcat that's celebrated, because you don't get that in a lot of organizations. And I think that's why we're leading the way within the tech industry for diversity and inclusion.
No, absolutely. And that's incredible, the fact that you have, I suppose, places where people have a platform to talk about these things. Or as you said, I think the word unity came up, which I think is really, really powerful, and really helpful for people in those situations. I suppose then, again, kind of like a broad one, but what advice could you tell people who perhaps maybe don't have these kind of networks in their organizations, to help them or encourage them, I suppose, to either start them up or maybe start a conversation with people, maybe their employers?
It only takes one person to make a change. It takes one person with an idea. I think we should have this network, and you might be the only member for 3 months, but what these networks do, or these groups, whatever your organization calls them, is it's creating a safe environment for people to share their stories and to share a part of themselves that maybe they haven't done before in their workplace. And think about how much of our lives we spend in the workplace. It's such a large amount of time to spend maybe hiding something away or not being open about it. And a lot of people just want to talk to people about it, to share their experiences, their stories, to celebrate these things. So if there are people out there listening who don't have those networks, as I said, it takes one person to make the suggestion, to bring that up. It doesn't need to be anything really formal. You could just have a little meeting at lunchtime for 10-15 minutes. And that's how these things usually start, is with an idea, just someone wanting to create that environment and running with it. And, I imagine all those years ago when these networks started, that's how they came about. And that's how the EDN came about, was people really wanting to celebrate our employees with disabilities and neurodiversities. And it's just snowballed into what it is now. And that's how these things happen. So 100% takes one person to make that change. So if there's anyone out there who wants to start one, go for it. If you want to chat about it, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to lend you my ear to listen to any ideas you have about it.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So it all just starts with one idea, and all you have to do is say it, and then hopefully then it will start to snowball into that. But I think that's really valuable advice, definitely to businesses who want to place that at a huge focus. I think that's a really good place to start. Amazing. And then I suppose then to touch again further on your journey, I suppose more so your journey at Softcat specifically, and the transition into management that you've recently been undergoing, really. Actually, more of a broad one though, but how have you found the recent transition into more of a management position?
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I adore it. It's what I've always wanted to do. It was something I knew when I joined Softcat and I was speaking to my managers. I always looked up to them and I thought, oh, I really want to do that. I want to help other people develop their skills. It's something that I'd done before I joined Softcat. I'd coached cheerleading for a long time. So I'd always been involved in teaching others and helping others to grow their skills. So as soon as I joined Softcat, I sat down with our senior team leader, James Meir, and said, I really want to be a manager. What do I need to do? And we put steps in place for me to get there. And yeah, here I am now, managing 2 SDPs and 2 apprentices, and I absolutely adore it. It's a challenge, but it's a fun challenge, and it's important to keep pushing yourself and striving to improve. And I think it makes me a better salesperson for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely touch on the challenges sometimes that it can pose then. But what you just touched on there, so you mentioned obviously previously doing coaching in cheerleading. I think, is it 6 times national champion cheerleading coach, which obviously is fantastic achievement. How has that actually helped you in terms of your transition into management in Softcat?
So I'd never done cheerleading before, which is so funny in hindsight, obviously having achieved what I have. But I went to university, sat with my flatmate on my first day, and she said, please will you come to cheer with me? I don't want to go alone. And I said, all right, yeah, fine. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. And a year in, I was asked to coach, started doing it, really unsure of what I was doing. Never been anyone's manager, coach, anything before. And I just slotted into it. I absolutely adored it. So I did 3 years of that. I coached gymnastics and cheer outside of that as well. So it was basically my whole life for about 3 years, hence the 6 national titles, because I just gave all of my time to it. But although it seems like a completely different world from sales, which obviously it is, it's a lot of the same fundamental skills. I was taking university students who had no experience in cheerleading, teaching them the skills, growing their confidence, helping them to flourish in that environment, and then delivering the results and celebrating with them when we won. And it's the same thing within the job that I do now. It's so similar. I take new starts that come into the program, I help them to develop their skills, I mentor them, I'm a source of reason, of advice, of knowledge. I help them to grow their confidence, and then the aim for them is to become an account manager and join a sales team. And it's a very similar process, really. So there's a lot of parallels there. It's just obviously cheerleading and sales are slightly different skill sets, but a lot of the same sort of mentorship applies to it, I would say, and peer mentoring as well. It's not, for me, management is not about telling or being a power figure. It's so much more about enabling them to grow and finding out how best to help them, I suppose.
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of parallels then in what you've previously done, which can really help. And then obviously then touching on the fact that you mentioned it's been so much fun. Obviously going into management, it has been challenging though at the same time. What kinds of challenges have you faced so far?
I think the key challenge for me has been transitioning from being a peer to being a manager, because there are obviously responsibilities that come with that. And Softcat as an organization, our culture is we have a flat hierarchy. Our sales manager sits 2 desks away from me. It's very peer-to-peer environment. But obviously with new starts, there's a different level of expectation, and you have to set that pathway for them because they're new to the business. They don't know the ins and outs. They don't, they need a lot more help. And I think the challenge for me has been transitioning from being a peer with them to now being responsible for their success in a lot of ways, being responsible for ensuring that they're on the right path and that they're doing the right behaviors and the right things day in, day out. That's been a challenge for me, is finding some of that, I suppose. I think a lot of it, and I know people will always say this in management, is the imposter syndrome of who am I to tell this person how to structure their day, what to do. But I think it's just something that you have to get over, because they're relying on you to be a source of help, to be a mentor, a guide. And you can't let your own feeling of who allowed me to do this, why am I doing this, get in the way of helping them and being there for them in the way that they need you to be in that moment, however that looks. And it's different day to day with each of them. Some days they'll be really confident and feeling like they're getting the hang of it, and some days things will go wrong and they'll need a real support, uplifting conversation to get them back on track. So it's completely different.
Sure, absolutely. So I suppose the transition on what you've done, and I think imposter syndrome, that's such a massive thing, because I think, as you said, when you are going from a peer to now someone in leadership who's coaching, managing, trying to tell someone how to structure their day and how to be successful, it can be a massive jump in that sense. And actually, I suppose then, what tips can you give someone who wants to transition into management to maybe overcome imposter syndrome, or perhaps just any challenges that they might be facing?
I think speaking to people who are already doing the role is so helpful. And that's why I sat down pretty early on and said to my manager, I'd really like to be a manager. This is my goal. What do I need to do? Because what that did was it gave me steps to prepare myself. So there were different things that I did in order to gain experience, to feel like I really was ready to step into that role. And that was important for me, as I didn't want to, I wanted to do it when I was ready and when I felt that I could actually offer a lot of value to people coming into the business. So I think that the key advice I would give others is, people are scared to say early on in their career, I'd like to be a manager, but you're not going in saying, I'd like to be a manager now. You're going in and saying, this is my goal. What do I need to do? Can you help me to achieve this? And what steps can I take to improve myself, to develop the skills? And I think being able to have those conversations, again, I know I've talked about this so much, but being open and honest and just saying, this is what I want to do. What do I need to do to get there? It can set out a pathway for you that means that when you do get around to getting the position, hopefully, you feel that you've done what you needed to do to feel ready for that and to feel prepared. And I think that for me was the key thing to getting over the imposter syndrome, was the fact that I'd set this goal for so long. I'd worked really hard to get here. So I now needed to thrive and to flourish in this role and to really do it justice and do myself justice for what I knew I'd wanted to do for so long, and to not let that imposter syndrome get in the way of my ability to perform well in a management role.
Great. So that, I suppose, that preemptive preparation has been a massive help for you. And then just to finally touch on, then earlier you mentioned one massive thing for you was having very strong female leadership actually in your team, and that's hugely influenced you as well in terms of your progression. I suppose, yeah, how has that been a help, having those strong female leaders when you first started to now when you're now stepping into leadership?
So I'm hugely fortunate in Leeds to have my mentor, Georgia Swainston, who is such a source of strength for me, and my team leader, Iona Simiku, who is the first woman in our Leeds office to hit several milestones within our organisation. So she is a massive source of inspiration for me, and having that presence around me has been transformative. I think we, as an industry, within technology, within sales, it's always a struggle to get women into these positions, and it's a struggle to get women to stay. And it is a male-dominated environment, and it takes a lot of strength and determination for us as women to really thrive in those environments. But having that presence of female leadership for me was transformative. They have overcome every obstacle that they have faced. They have defied every expectation. They have outperformed every challenge that they've had. And you can't replicate that in any other, for me at least, there's no way that that inspiration could be replicated in any other form. Actually seeing someone physically in front of you doing that day in, day out and achieving what they're achieving as a woman in sales is, to me, the biggest source of inspiration. And I take a lot of my own management style from having them around to teach me, because so much of what they've said to me has stayed with me and formed me into the salesperson I am today. So I have to say that they have been transformative to my sales career, and I'm not sure what salesperson I would be if it wasn't for both Georgia and Iona who mentor and manage me.
Fantastic. No, appreciate you sharing. And there's so many questions I'm sure that we can touch on going into that, but obviously just conscious of time. So I suppose coming up to rounding off the call a little bit then, very broadly speaking, a couple broad questions though. What is the best piece of advice you've received in your career?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I would say, again, comes from James Wiley, and it was quite early on in my career. He said to me that in this role, customer service was everything, and to forget everything else, customer service was the number one thing. You know, as salespeople, we're driven by sales targets, we're driven by numbers, but you can't boil down an experience, a customer experience, to just those things. And that, for me, I remember that moment, it changed the way that I worked within my role. He said that that's all he focuses on is the customer happy? Are we making the customer happy? And everything else falls into place behind that. And for me, I think that changed a lot of how I worked with my customers and in general. And actually, I think it's probably a lot of the reason that I've done pretty well in my job is because of that advice to really focus on the customer relationships.
Amazing. And then I suppose putting it to you then, the big question about why we do this whole podcast: what needs to be done to change the perception of sales and make it a career of choice?
So we had our CFO in our office last week, and he said something that was really powerful and has really stuck with me. he said, so he's going to be our CEO of Softcat next year. He will be transitioning into that role. And he said that whilst focusing on diversity and inclusion is incredibly important, diversity will come if you are inclusive. And it's a result of inclusion. And I think that that is just so true and a powerful piece of advice, because the reality is Softcat are creating an environment that is inclusive for everyone, that makes everyone feel celebrated and welcome. And I think it's something that other companies need to be adopting without a doubt. So I think that, in my opinion, the biggest change in our industry needs to be allowing spaces and safe spaces for these conversations to happen, because realistically that's how you're going to get the best out of people in your business, is by having conversations and allowing them to open up about their experiences. So in my opinion, it's creating more inclusivity, and that comes from the people at the top, or the people who are just joining, starting those environments that, and those clubs, those teams, those networks that create spaces to allow people to thrive in the best way possible for them.
Great, fantastic. Immy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. You've given an incredible insight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Immy.
Thank you so much for listening to the Changing the Perception of Sales podcast. Please subscribe and follow for more. If you like this content, also please check out This Is Prime on all our social media channels, and also Kyle Gallagher and Lizzie Formisano on LinkedIn. See you next time.